is if you got the weapons, you're going to use them. And, you look at the Ukraine and, the excuse is, and Mitch McConnell and, a lot of the Republican senators are now saying is they're saying, don't worry, we need the Ukraine war because our weaponry was getting old and, we were inventorying in warehouses and we're unloading all that stuff on there so that we can make new stuff. And that's, that is...
I find that to be a foolish argument,
well,
but what I would ask you on...
Listen, I watch what's happening, and I see who owns all the military contractors who are making a profit, Northrop Grumman, Boeing,
Lockheed Martin, yes.
General Dynamics.
Yes.
They're all owned by Black Rock. So Black Rock is now making a profit, destroying Ukraine, and who got the contract?
To be fair, Black Rock did not invade Ukraine. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the question that I would ask is when it comes to Ukraine...
But why did we feel like that war, in my view, is a war about the expansion of NATO, our right to expand NATO into Ukraine, and was something that we promised that we would never do.
I mean, that's factually untrue. We did not actually promise the Russians that we would never expand NATO.
Well, we did.
Gorbachev himself has said that this is not the case.
Yeah, well, but there have been all kinds of analyses that look at it. I mean, listen,
I'm not suggesting that Putin doesn't fear that. Putin certainly fears it.
Admits that he told Gorbachev, when Gorbachev said, the question is not whether we made the promise, Ben, whether it was memorialized in a proper writing, that it was part of an understood agreement. It was an agreement at that time. Gorbachev allowed the unification of Germany under NATO, which was a huge concession for him that made it so. He was loathed in Russia ever since. And the one thing he said is that to President Bush and James Baker and John Major at that time is, I want your agreement that you'll never move NATO to the east.
Gorbachev has denied this, but beyond that, the real question is, let's assume that all that's true. Let's assume this is about fear of Ukraine joining NATO. So first of all, Zelensky himself, when he was a comedian, made all sorts of shorts about the fact that NATO actually kept flirting with Ukraine. I agree the West's policy with regard to NATO and Ukraine was flirtatious, but it never reached the point of consummation, which is one of the big complaints in Ukraine, was sort of that Zelensky, believe it or not, before the war was actually sort of the left-wing peacenik version of the leadership in Ukraine. He was hit from the right before he actually was elected president of Ukraine. But even assuming all this, and I'll assume your case for the sake of argument. Right now, Russia has obvious control of huge sections of Donbass. They retain control of Crimea. Is it in America's interest to withdraw aid to the point where Ukraine itself is in danger of Russian ingestion?
Well, Gorbachev, as you point out, Zelensky ran in 2019 on the Minsk Accords, saying that he promised he was a peacenik, and that he would sign the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords basically had three demands from the Russians that everybody agreed to. The UK had agreed, Germany agreed, France agreed. The three things that Putin wanted, and it's what not only Putin, but the entire Kremlin leadership and generations of leader back to 1992, not beginning with Putin. They wanted a guarantee of neutrality for Ukraine, which means keeping NATO out. They wanted a denazification of the government that we put in place in 2014 when we helped overthrow the elected government of the Ukraine. The CIA and Victoria Nuland helped overthrow them and brought in 5 ministers who were, calling them ultra-nationalists is a polite description. And you well know of the Nazi history in Ukraine. And these 5 ministers who were legacies of Stefan Bandera, et cetera. And the last thing that he wanted was that protection for the ethnic Russian population of Donbass and Lugansk, who were being brutalized. 14,000 have been killed. And the first thing when we put the new government in 2014, one of the first things it did was to get rid of the Russian language. It used to have, half the people.
There's no question that, first of all, the Minsk Accords were extremely poorly written and violated extraordinarily on both sides of that particular agreement,
Well,
including
the
by the
thing
Russians
is
who put
that
little green men
Zelensky-
in Donbass and Crimea. But again, this doesn't answer the question as to whether the United States, I don't really care about the internal politics of Ukraine nearly at all. The question is it in the interest of the United States at this point, given the fact that Vladimir Putin has not really gotten back to the off-ramp that I was pushing for, and I think we were both pushing for, I think, in the middle of 2022. Right? So it's Henry Kissinger, this sort of off-ramp, let's get out of this war as fast as possible, negotiated settlement. That obviously goes by the wayside, and so now we're in 2024 still discussing the war. Putin has not offered any sort of material off-ramp at this point to Zelensky, and Zelensky has not opted to take any off-ramp. So what is in America's interest? If we
what you said is
withdraw
just
aid-
not true. That's just not true. First of all, the Minsk Accords, although you can complain about some of the language, it was agreed upon by France, by Germany, by the UK, and Zelensky campaigned in 2019 on the promise that he was going to sign it and ratify it before the parliament. He was then, when he got in, he pivoted. The suspicion is that he pivoted for two reasons. One, his life was threatened by the ultra-rightists in his own government. And two, Victoria Nuland from the State Department said, we don't want peace with the Russians. In April of 2022, and that was what prompted the invasion of Crimea, which, by the way, my uncle, was going to invade Cuba in 1962 because the Russians put missiles there. Well, I understand, and the Russians put missiles in Cuba because we had put Jupiter missiles in Turkey. So everybody knew that neither of our powers wanted nuclear missiles in within range of our capital. And not only did we put missiles in Romania and Poland, Aegis missile systems, which are Tomahawk missiles, which are nuclear ready, Lockheed's missiles, 12 minutes from the Kremlin, able to decapitate the entire Kremlin leadership in 12 minutes. Not only did we do that, President Trump and his predecessor walked away from our two intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with the Soviet Union, with Russia. So we said to Russia, we're unilaterally walking away from these nuke treaties and we're putting nukes in your backyard. What kind of message? If they did that to us, put them in Mexico, Canada, Cuba, we would invade. Now, in terms of what Putin's offer was, Putin only went into Crimea after Zelensky broke his promise.
No, the Donbass and Crimea were invaded in 2014.
Right. So in April of 2022, after
the invasion was February 2022. Yes.
Yeah, April 2022. Zelensky, we will not help Zelensky negotiate a treaty with the Russians. So he goes to Erdogan in Turkey, and he goes to Naftali Bennett from Israel. They negotiate essentially Minsk II, which does the same thing.
Right.
What now we know from Naftali Bennett, from Erdogan, from the Ukrainian negotiators, is that everybody, and from Putin himself, she talked about in the Tucker interview, is that everybody agreed to it. Both sides initialed that agreement. Putin was withdrawing his troops from Kiev when Biden sent Boris Johnson over to force Zelensky to tear up the agreement.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that was also the same time that they walked into Bakhmut and saw the human rights violations, and that's the excuse that Zelensky uses, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, but again, you're exact.
But that's fine.
No,
that's fine.
That's
again,
the perfect word to use, an excuse.
That's all fine. I just come back to the same question. Is it in America's interest to let Russia walk into Kyiv and take control of Ukraine?
But I didn't say that.
No, I'm not putting it in your mouth. It's a literal question.
Oh, I don't think Russia wants to control Kyiv.
That was literally the purpose of the war. The original purpose of the war was to take Kyiv.
No.
I mean, Putin made this. He tried to invade Kyiv. They were in the outskirts of Kyiv. They tried to land in helicopters.
What he has said consistently is that we need to do this to keep NATO out. And he's got support of his own people. He's got support of the Kremlin. And what I said is it's not either, him and all of these comic book descriptions, which I know you're a really smart guy, and I don't know, how you end up endorsing this of the supervillains that were given every couple of
No, he's a
years.
hardcore political realist. But Vladimir Putin is a hard power political realpolitik expert. He's an
Vladimir
excellent chess
Putin
player.
has said repeatedly, I want to negotiate this. And Zelensky has passed a law in Ukraine that says we can't negotiate with
Again,
him.
I've actively suggested as a solution that Joe Biden go to Putin around Zelensky and negotiate a solution and then make
Well, of
American
course.
aid to
Okay,
Ukraine
well, then you
contingent.
and I agree on that.
Okay, so but until that point happens, until that negotiation
Why
happens,
doesn't it happen tomorrow? I'll tell you what, it's going to happen the day I get into office.
okay, let's assume that you go with Putin and you have a disagreement. Do you continue to fund Ukraine up to the point where agreement is reached?
Of course you continue, but I'm going to have a ceasefire. And I'm going to negotiate agreement. I'm not going to give ground until we have an agreement.
Okay, fair enough. So that was the question, because this started off with kind of a broader discussion of American military.
Yeah, no,
policy.
I would never suggest that. I've been negotiating my whole life. I've negotiated 500 cases.
We'll get to more on this.